In 2018, archaeologists studying the victims of Pompeii made a discovery that upended everything we thought we knew about who actually died there. When they analyzed the coins found clutched in the hands of 206 bodies, they expected to find people who had grabbed their savings before fleeing. What they found instead revealed something far more disturbing about the final hours of this city. 90% of Pompeii's population escaped the eruption. That number surprises most people because we tend to imagine the entire city frozen in a single catastrophic moment, everyone killed where they stood, mid-bite, mid-conversation. The reality is messier and more human. The eruption gave people 17 hours of warning before the killing phase began. 17 hours is enough time to walk to the next city. It is enough time to load a cart and drive to safety. It is enough time to make a choice. So who were the 10% who stayed behind? And what did the coins in their hands reveal about why they never made it out? Professor Kimberly Bowes of the University of Pennsylvania spent months cataloging those coins. She reasoned that in a disaster, people grab their portable wealth, cash they can carry. The amounts would tell us something about who these victims were. 95% of the bodies carried between 1 and 50 sestertii. To put that in perspective, 50 sestertii would feed a free Roman citizen for about 2 days. For an enslaved person, that same amount represented roughly 2 weeks of food allowance from their master. The wealthy homeowners of Pompeii, the merchants, the property owners, their strongboxes were found empty. They had taken their money and fled. The people who died in those luxurious houses, clutching tiny amounts of coins, were not the people who owned them. Mount Vesuvius had been dormant for 1,200 years. 1,200 years is a long time to forget that a mountain can kill you. The earthquakes that had rattled Pompeii in the days leading up to August 24th, 79 CE weren't unusual. This was a seismically active region. People associated tremors with ordinary geological activity, not volcanic precursors. Nobody had any reason to be alarmed. Around 1 in the afternoon, Pliny the Younger's mother spotted something unusual in the sky above the mountain. A cloud was forming, but not like any cloud she had seen before. It rose in a tall column and then spread outward at the top, like the branches of a stone pine tree. The shape would later be called a Plinian column, named after the family who first documented it. Her brother, Pliny the Elder, commanded the Roman fleet stationed at Misenum across the Bay of Naples. When he saw the cloud, his first instinct was scientific curiosity. He ordered a ship prepared so he could observe the phenomenon more closely. Then a message arrived from a friend trapped near the volcano, begging for rescue. Pliny the Elder redirected his mission toward the disaster zone. Back in Pompeii, ash began drifting over the city within the hour. At first it seemed almost manageable, a gray powder settling on rooftops and streets, an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. Then the pumice started falling. White stones the size of eggs rained from the sky at a rate of 10 to 15 centimeters per hour. These were not gentle. They fell at 50 meters per second, fast enough to injure, fast enough to kill if they struck you on the head. The sun, blocked by the ash column climbing 21 to 33 kilometers into the stratosphere, vanished from the sky. Midday became midnight. Imagine standing in your home as the light disappears. Imagine hearing the constant drumbeat of stones striking your roof, a percussion that never stops, that only intensifies. Imagine the weight of those stones accumulating, hour after hour, until the roof beams begin to groan. This was the moment of choice. Do you stay inside, hoping it will pass? Or do you gather what you can carry and walk into that darkness, into that rain of stones, and take your chances on the road? Most people chose to leave. The archaeological evidence is clear on this point. When excavators opened the stables of Pompeii's wealthy homes, they found them empty. No horses, no mules, no carts. The animals had been harnessed and driven away. The strongboxes where families kept their cash were found open and emptied. People had made rational calculations about survival and acted on them. By evening, nearly 9 feet of pumice had accumulated in the streets. The people still inside, whether by choice, by circumstance, or by orders they could not refuse, had now run out of time. The first phase of the eruption was ending. The second phase was about to begin. Around 11:15 p.m. on August 24th, the volcanic column that had been climbing for 10 hours became too heavy to sustain itself. It collapsed. When a volcanic column collapses, the material does not simply fall straight down. It cascades outward in all directions as a pyroclastic surge, a turbulent, superheated mixture of gas, ash, and pulverized rock that rides on a cushion of compressed air. This cushion allows the surge to move at speeds exceeding 450 miles per hour. It can travel uphill. It can cross water. It does not stop for walls or buildings or any obstacle humans might construct. Herculaneum, closer to the volcano than Pompeii, was hit first. 300 to 340 people had gathered in the boathouses along Herculaneum's waterfront. These were arched stone chambers built to store small vessels, and on that night they were packed with people hoping for rescue by sea. Some were wealthy. Excavators found gold jewelry and fine clothing among the remains. Others were clearly working class. They had all made the same calculation. The harbor offered escape. The pyroclastic surge arrived before the boats. What happened next has been reconstructed through forensic analysis of the skeletal remains. When scientists examined the bones of Herculaneum's victims using spectroscopic techniques, they found something unusual: extraordinarily high concentrations of iron oxide. Iron oxide is what you get when hemoglobin, the protein that makes blood red, undergoes thermal decomposition. The iron from the blood had bonded to the bone. This only happens at extreme temperatures, when blood literally boils inside the body. The temperature inside those boathouses reached somewhere between 400 and 900 degrees Fahrenheit. At the lower end of that range, water boils. At the higher end, you can fire pottery. Many of the skulls found in Herculaneum display a distinctive pattern, radiating fractures spreading outward from the interior. These fractures occur when fluid inside the skull, brain tissue, blood, cerebrospinal fluid, turns to steam and expands violently. The pressure builds until the bone fails. Bodies show another telltale sign: the pugilistic attitude. This is a forensic term for a specific posture: hands clenched into fists, arms drawn up toward the chest, legs bent at the knees. It happens when extreme heat causes muscles to contract and stiffen in a particular way. You see it in victims of house fires. You see it in Herculaneum. Death at these temperatures is measured in fractions of a second. The nervous system does not have time to register pain in any meaningful way. The victims in those boathouses experienced, according to the forensic evidence, no time to display any defensive reaction. One moment they were alive, pressed together in the darkness, waiting for ships that would never come. The next moment, they simply were not. Pompeii sat 6 miles farther from Vesuvius than Herculaneum. 6 miles is not very far. You can walk it in 2 hours. A pyroclastic surge traveling at 450 miles per hour crosses it in less than a minute. Those 6 miles saved no one who remained in Pompeii. They did not provide enough distance for the surge to cool below lethal temperatures. The air that swept through Pompeii's streets still registered between 360 and 680 degrees Fahrenheit. What those 6 miles did provide was a different kind of death. When researchers analyzed the remains found in Pompeii using the same spectroscopic techniques applied to Herculaneum, they found a different elemental signature. The iron oxide concentrations that indicated boiling blood were largely absent. The pugilistic attitude was less common. The radiating skull fractures from internal pressure were rare. Instead, the Pompeian dead showed something else: relaxed body positions. People lying prone as if they had simply gone to sleep. People with their hands raised to their faces, covering their mouths and noses. People who had clearly been alive for seconds, perhaps minutes, after the surge arrived. The Pompeians did not die from instant thermal shock. They died from asphyxiation. The pyroclastic surge that entered Pompeii carried a cocktail of volcanic gases: carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, hydrogen chloride, hydrogen fluoride. Each of these compounds attacks the human body in its own way. Sulfur dioxide burns. When it contacts moisture in your eyes, in your throat, in your lungs, it forms sulfuric acid. The membranes of your respiratory tract begin to swell and blister. Hydrogen sulfide smells like rotten eggs, but that smell disappears at high concentrations because it paralyzes the olfactory nerve. At lethal doses, it inhibits cellular respiration at the mitochondrial level. Your cells lose the ability to use oxygen even if oxygen is present. Carbon dioxide, the most abundant volcanic gas, is heavier than air. It pools in low-lying areas, in basements, in the bottoms of rooms. It displaces oxygen without announcing itself. There is no smell, no warning, just a gradual dimming of consciousness as your brain starves for what it needs. Mixed with all of these gases was the ash itself. Not coarse ash like cigarette ash, ultra-fine particulate matter, microscopic shards of volcanic glass suspended in superheated air. When you breathe this material in, it coats the inside of your lungs. It mixes with the moisture in your airways and forms a paste. On the second breath, the paste thickens. On the third breath, the paste begins to set. The people of Pompeii suffocated with volcanic cement filling their lungs. The body positions preserved in the famous plaster casts tell this story. Some victims are found with fabric pressed to their faces, togas, tunics, whatever cloth was at hand, in a final attempt to filter the air. Others are found with their hands cupped over their mouths and noses. These are not the positions of people killed instantly. These are the positions of people who had time to react, time to recognize what was happening, time to try something, anything, to survive the next breath. Time to fail. The process took somewhere between seconds and minutes. The exact duration depended on where you were when the surge hit, how much protection the building around you provided, how deeply you breathed in those first moments. Some people may have lost consciousness within 20 seconds as hypoxia and carbon dioxide narcosis set in. Others may have remained aware for longer, feeling their airways close, feeling the heat searing their skin, feeling their lungs fill with something that would not come out. The Pompeians died slowly enough to know they were dying. In 2025, archaeologists excavating a house on Via del Vesuvio made a discovery that illuminated the psychology of catastrophe. The house, named the House of Helle and Phrixus after a mythological fresco on its walls, contained the remains of 4 people, possibly a family, including at least 1 child. Roman houses of this period featured an architectural element called an atrium, an open-roofed courtyard designed to collect rainwater. When the pumice began falling on August 24th, the atrium became a funnel, channeling volcanic stones directly into the center of the home. The 4 inhabitants recognized the danger. They retreated to a small bedroom at the back of the house, dragging a heavy wooden bedframe with them. They positioned the bed against the door, sealing themselves inside. This was not an irrational choice. In fact, it was probably the best available option. The interior room offered protection from the falling stones. The closed door provided insulation from the ash filling the rest of the house. They had food. Archaeologists found amphorae of garum, the expensive fish sauce that functioned as a Roman condiment. They had warmth, they had each other, and they had reason to believe the eruption would eventually stop. For 17 hours, their strategy worked. Around 6 in the morning on August 25th, everything changed. The pyroclastic surges that had been striking Herculaneum began reaching Pompeii. The 4th and 5th surges, the most devastating, swept through the city between 6:30 and 6:45 a.m. Inside the sealed bedroom, the temperature began to rise. The toxic gases seeping through cracks in the walls and around the edges of the door grew more concentrated. The 4 people inside made a calculation. The room that had protected them for 17 hours was now becoming a trap. They pulled the bed away from the door. They ran. They made it as far as the triclinium, the dining room. That is where archaeologists found their remains, all 4 of them, along with a bronze protective amulet called a bulla and the ghostly outline in ash where the wooden bed frame had been, preserved for nearly 2,000 years. The excavation reveals something profound about human behavior in extremis. These people did not simply accept their fate. They evaluated their circumstances. They adapted their strategy. And when conditions changed, they took action. Their action failed, but the failure was not for lack of trying. They died running toward the door, toward the possibility of survival, toward hope. Not everyone in Pompeii died from heat or asphyxiation. The eruption triggered multiple secondary hazards, including a succession of earthquakes that rocked the city throughout the night. In a structure called the Insula of the Chaste Lovers, archaeologists found the remains of 2 men crouched in a corner beneath a collapsed wall. Skeletal analysis revealed something significant. Their bones rested on top of the lower pumice layer, not buried within it. This meant they had survived the entire first phase of the eruption, the 17-hour pumice fall, and were still alive when the surges began. They had sought shelter in what appeared to be a sturdy building. They had found a corner that seemed protected. They were waiting for the disaster to pass. An earthquake struck sometime between the pumice fall and the arrival of the pyroclastic surges. The building's upper structure failed. The two men were crushed by falling masonry before the killing cloud ever reached them. Their deaths remind us that volcanic eruptions are not single events, but cascades of interconnected hazards. The ground shakes, buildings weaken, roofs collapse under accumulated weight, fires break out, water sources become contaminated. Even people who successfully avoid the primary volcanic threats may fall victim to secondary effects that ripple through the disaster zone. This brings us back to the coins. Professor Bose's analysis revealed that the vast majority of Pompeii's victims were not wealthy property owners. They were not merchants or professionals or members of the civic elite. They were people carrying pocket change. Amounts too small to suggest accumulated savings, amounts consistent with small allowances given to household servants. The implication is difficult to escape. Many of the people who died in Pompeii's wealthy homes were enslaved workers who had been ordered to stay behind. This was not necessarily cruelty, at least not by Roman standards. Enslaved people represented significant financial investments. A skilled domestic servant might cost thousands of sestertii, far more than the contents of the average strongbox. Property owners fleeing the eruption had every expectation of returning after the disaster passed. They would reclaim their homes, assess the damage, and resume their lives. Their slaves would be waiting for them. This calculation assumed the eruption would end. It assumed the city would survive. It assumed there would be something to come back to. The enslaved people left behind had no way of knowing these assumptions were wrong. They had no way of knowing that the pyroclastic surges approaching the city would kill everyone in their path. They had orders, and in the Roman world, slaves followed orders. The skeletal evidence supports this interpretation. Many of the victims found in Pompeii show signs of good nutrition and dental health, indicators not of poverty, but of being well maintained as valuable property. These were not abandoned street people or indigent beggars caught by surprise. These were domestic workers in their prime, people their owners intended to use again. Some may have chosen to stay. In a household with close bonds between owners and servants, enslaved individuals might have genuinely cared about protecting the family property. Others may have believed, as their owners did, that the eruption would pass. Still others may have had elderly family members or young children who could not make the journey to safety. What we know for certain is this: when the strongboxes were opened and the coins were counted, the dead of Pompeii were overwhelmingly poor. The people who had the resources to flee used those resources. The people without resources remained. Catastrophe in Pompeii, as in every disaster since, followed the contours of inequality. The flip side of this story is that 90% of the population escaped. Between 15,000 and 20,000 people lived in Pompeii and Herculaneum combined. Excavations over nearly 3 centuries have uncovered approximately 1,500 bodies. The rest got out. The evidence for successful evacuation is everywhere in the archaeological record. Empty stables, emptied strongboxes, abandoned valuables that were simply too heavy to carry. The people of Pompeii did not freeze in place, caught by surprise. They made decisions, gathered their families, loaded their carts, and left. Some fled by sea. Pliny the Elder's rescue mission, though ultimately fatal for him, succeeded in evacuating at least some people from the coastal town of Stabiae. Other boats made similar journeys across the Bay of Naples, carrying refugees to Misenum, Naples, and points south. Others fled overland. The roads leading away from Vesuvius would have been crowded that afternoon and evening. Streams of people on foot, in carts, on horseback, all moving in the same direction. Away. Anywhere that was away. Researchers have tracked what happened to these survivors by following names. Certain family names were unique to Pompeii. The Pompeii, the Umbri, distinctive enough that when they appear in inscriptions elsewhere, they almost certainly indicate Pompeian refugees. At least 130 survivors have been identified through this method, their names carved into tombstones and public monuments in Naples, Puteoli, and surrounding communities. They married into local populations, they established new businesses, they rebuilt their lives. Some, remarkably, returned. Archaeological evidence shows that people resettled in Pompeii's ruins within years of the eruption. Buildings whose upper stories extended above the ash layer were reoccupied. Cellars were excavated and converted into workshops. Salvage operations recovered valuables from buried homes. The city never returned to its former glory, but it did not remain entirely dead either. The survivors carried their memories with them. We know Pliny the Younger's account survived because he wrote letters about the eruption years later, responding to a historian's request for information. Other survivors surely told their own stories, though those accounts have been lost. The trauma of that day, the darkness, the falling stones, the screams in the streets, the desperate flight through choking ash, became part of their personal histories, passed down to children and grandchildren, eventually fading into the general silence of history. In the 1860s, an archaeologist named Giuseppe Fiorelli developed a technique that would make Pompeii famous worldwide. He noticed that the hardened volcanic ash contained hollow spaces where bodies had once been. The flesh had decayed, but the void remained, a negative impression of the dead. Fiorelli poured liquid plaster into these voids. When the plaster hardened and the surrounding ash was chipped away, what emerged were ghostly white sculptures of the victims, people frozen in their final moments, their expressions and postures seemingly preserved for eternity. These casts became iconic. They appeared in museums, in photographs, in documentaries. They seemed to offer an unmediated window into ancient tragedy, a mother sheltering her child, a family huddled together, lovers embracing in their final moments. In 2024, DNA analysis shattered many of these interpretations. When researchers extracted genetic material from the bones inside the casts, they discovered that many of the assumed family groupings were nothing of the kind. A cast long displayed as a mother protecting her child turned out to contain two unrelated individuals. A group presented as a family included people with diverse genetic backgrounds who had no familial connection. The romantic narratives attached to these casts, the devoted spouse, the protective parent, the inseparable siblings, were modern inventions. Past archaeologists had not merely preserved the dead, they had created stories about them, enhancing features, adjusting postures, imposing their own assumptions about Roman family life onto people who were simply strangers who happened to die in the same room. This does not make the casts meaningless. They still preserve genuine evidence of body positions, of the desperate gestures people made in their final moments. A person found with hands raised to their face was probably trying to protect their airways, regardless of whether they were related to the person lying next to them. What the DNA revelation does is remind us that we bring our own expectations to the past. We want to see families together, love persisting through catastrophe, human connection triumphing over mortality. Sometimes the evidence supports these narratives. Often it does not. The dead of Pompeii were individuals with their own complex lives, their own relationships, their own reasons for being where they were when the surge arrived. They deserve to be understood on their own terms, not forced into sentimental categories that make us feel better about tragedy. Let me walk you through what the final hour felt like for someone who remained in Pompeii. It is the early morning of August 25th, 79 CE. You have survived the night. The pumice that fell for 17 hours has finally stopped. The ground is covered in nearly 9 feet of volcanic debris. But the rain of stones has ended. Perhaps the worst is over. You emerge from wherever you have been sheltering, a back room, a cellar, a corner where the ceiling held. The air is thick with ash, visibility poor, the light strange and gray. Other survivors are visible, picking their way through the debris, calling out for family members, assessing the damage. Then, the temperature begins to rise. At first, it might seem like the return of the sun, the natural warming of morning. Then it becomes too warm, too fast. A wind begins to blow, not a normal wind, but something heavy, laden with particulate matter, searing against exposed skin. You look toward Vesuvius and see it, a wall of gray-brown cloud rolling down the slope faster than anything you have ever seen move. It is too late to run. It is too late to seek shelter. It is too late for anything except the next breath. The surge enters the city at ground level, filling streets like water fills a channel. It is not a solid wall, but a turbulent mixture, swirling and eddying around buildings, finding gaps, pouring through windows and doors. The temperature inside this cloud exceeds 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Your first breath draws in superheated air mixed with fine volcanic glass. The heat sears your throat and airways. The particulate matter begins coating the inside of your lungs. You cough instinctively, trying to expel the material, but every cough draws in more. The gases in the mixture are already affecting your body chemistry. Carbon dioxide is building in your blood. Sulfur compounds are irritating every exposed membrane. You feel dizzy, lightheaded, increasingly confused. You raise your hands to your face, pressing cloth against your mouth and nose. It provides no real protection, but the instinct is overwhelming. Cover the airways, filter the air, survive the next breath. The ash paste forming in your lungs thickens. Your airways constrict. Each breath becomes more difficult than the last. Your vision narrows. Your thoughts slow. Within seconds to minutes, depending on your exact location, your lung capacity, the vagaries of the swirling cloud, you lose consciousness. Your body slumps wherever you happen to be standing. The ash continues to accumulate around you, preserving your form, your position, your final gesture. 1946 years later, an archaeologist will pour plaster into the void where your body used to be, and pull from the earth a white figure with hands raised to its face. Vesuvius stopped erupting at 8:05 p.m. on August 25th, 79 CE, roughly 32 hours after the first ash began falling on Pompeii. By then, the city was buried under 20 feet of volcanic material. So was Herculaneum. So were the surrounding farms and villages and roads. The survivors who had fled would eventually learn the scale of what had happened. They would learn that there was nothing to return to, that the homes they had left behind were gone, that the people they had left behind were dead. Some would rebuild nearby. Some would scatter across the Roman world. All of them would carry with them the memory of that day, the darkness at noon, the rain of stones, the moment when they chose to run. The choice to flee was not heroic in any obvious sense. It was simply rational, an assessment of risk, a calculation about survival. The people who made that choice lived. The people who did not, for whatever reason, died. What Pompeii teaches us is that catastrophe does not strike randomly. It follows the fault lines of society. The wealthy, the mobile, the free, they had options. The poor, the enslaved, the trapped, they had fewer. The coins clutched in dead hands tell us who was left behind when everyone who could leave had left. Pliny the Younger, watching from across the bay, heard the screams and saw the darkness. He described people calling for their parents, for their children, for their spouses, trying to find each other by voice alone in a world where the sun had been erased. Some of those people found each other. Some did not.